Okay, so today I've got three things that I want us to do. We're going to go over Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural, and if someone would like to read that in a moment, I would appreciate it. We're going to go through two parts of it. And then I've got a PowerPoint that I want to talk about dealing with the nature of republics. And in about 38 minutes or so, I'll hand back your midterms too. So those are the three things I want to do today. So let's turn to page 245, and I want to give a little bit of background here for Jefferson. Jefferson obviously is an incredibly important figure for us. He is the great genius born on American soil, maybe the finest mind ever born on American soil. Certainly a critical figure. And we have known him so far as the author of the Declaration of Independence. But this address that he gives here in 1801 is a really important address. This is for his inauguration, and I want you all to keep this in mind. We're on president number 45 at this point, and we take it for granted that for the most part, I'm not sure we should take it for granted, but we do. We take it for granted generally that we can transition from one president to the next without a lot of violence. We've really only had maybe one or two times in our nation's history where it's gotten really uncomfortable for a bit. And when it's gotten uncomfortable, it's gotten really uncomfortable, but we've never yet had a time where we didn't transition from one president to the next. The only time that we came really close to changing the tradition of America permanently was with the third election of Franklin Roosevelt. That broke all precedents. And of course, then they had to get a constitutional amendment to make sure that that would never happen again. And it's a good thing to make sure it doesn't matter left or right. Nobody should be president more than 8 years. That's just a factor of human nature, I think. But rarely have we had these problems. We get worked up about it, but we've rarely had these problems. But think about Thomas Jefferson in 1801. He is less than half a generation away from being into the U.S. Constitution. He's our third president of the United States. And John Adams and George Washington had gotten along very well. Jefferson, by this point in 1800 and 1801, wasn't getting along. Well, Washington's dead at this point, but they ended on a bad note. And he's not getting along with John Adams. So there was a big question. If we have a transfer of power and we move so radically from kind of the conservatism of John Adams to the radicalism of Thomas Jefferson, are we going to have an upheaval? Are we going to have a revolution? And almost anywhere else in the world, there would have been warring factions. And it came close. The 1800 election was really close. They had to go through 14 ballots to figure out who was actually going to be president. Jefferson won barely. But once he wins, he takes advantage of the win, and he's great at PR. And he calls it, because still to this day, this is still talked about in American textbooks, and it was just a campaign slogan. But still to this day, we call this the Revolution of 1800. That's taking it too far. The fact that we were able to avoid bloodshed is really important. That it was a whole new revolution on the revolution, that's a little too much. That's good campaign rhetoric, but it's not historical reality. But regardless, we do have a peaceful transition. Jefferson then, by coming into the White House, and he will be the second president to be in the White House, the first being John Adams, who had just moved in right before he was kicked out of office. Thomas Jefferson now is going to have to demonstrate to us not his partisanship, but his statesmanship. And he has been a partisan player for almost 10 years at this point, trying to create political parties. He was never successful, but trying to create political parties, trying to figure out how to form an opposition, whether loyal or not, to Washington and Adams. Now he finds himself in the executive. And so he's going to have to figure out, how does he play this out? So give this a little bit of context. As I just said, we are barely into the Constitution. We haven't even reached the 20-year point of the Constitution. That'll be 1808, 1809, when we get to the 20-year point of the Constitution. Jefferson comes into power, 1801, only the third president. The Constitution is young. Parties have not developed yet in America. We won't, and Hallie was asking this right before class, we won't actually see parties form until the late 1820s, where we'll see the Democratic and then the Whig Party will form. They'll be the first, but none up to that point. Federalists and Anti-Federalists are not parties in any way that we would think of. And Republicans and Federalists aren't parties either. They're movements, but there's nothing that we would recognize as a party like what we're watching with the Democratic Party right now and its nomination process. That just did not exist prior to 1827. So Jefferson's trying to figure out how to deal with all of this. And he's looking at America here, and I think we'll see this as we read through it, but he's looking at America as something that is profoundly old and also profoundly new at the same time. And this is the great tension, not just in Jefferson, but really the great tension in America. How ancient are we? How classical are we? Versus how romantic and new are we? This will be a strain throughout all of American history, trying to figure it out. And so you can have someone like Ronald Reagan, without question, the most conservative president of the 20th century. But his campaign slogan was, "It's always morning in America." Yeah, the ultimate kind of liberal Jeffersonian belief about things. And yet what made it always morning in America? It was because we're based on ancient ideals, that we have these principles. So it's always a tension with us. Are we new or are we old? And the best answer is we're both and neither and all of it all at once, which I realize is not a great answer, but it's still probably the most accurate answer. Okay, anybody want to read? Just starting here. Viga, that'd be great. So called upon to undertake the duties.
Called upon to undertake the duties of the first executive office of our country, I avail myself of the presence of that portion of my fellow citizens which is here assembled to express my grateful thanks for the favor with which they have been pleased to look towards me, to declare a sincere consciousness that the task is above my talents, and that I approach it with those anxious and awful presentiments which the greatness of the charge and the weakness of my powers so justly inspire. A rising nation, spread over a wide and fruitful land, traversing all the seas with the rich productions of their industry, engaged in commerce with nations who feel power and forget right, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. When I contemplate these transcendent objects and see the honor, the happiness, and the hopes of this beloved country committed to the issue and the auspices of this day, I shrink from the contemplation and humble myself before the magnitude of the undertaking. Utterly indeed should I despair, did not the presence of many whom I here see remind me that, in other high authorities provided by our Constitution, I shall find resources of wisdom, of virtue, and of zeal on which to rely under all difficulties. To you then, gentlemen, who are charged with the sovereign functions of legislation, and to those associated with you, I look with encouragement for that guidance and support which may enable us to steer with safety the vessel in which we are all embarked, amidst the conflicting elements of a troubled world.
Viga, let's stop there for a moment. I'll have you keep reading here in just a second. Thank you. So we've got this element of Jefferson being humble, and he actually means this, which you never put humility and Thomas Jefferson in the same sentence. That just doesn't work. Jefferson is not Washington on this. Washington was truly humble about who he was, and John Adams was too. Jefferson never humble, except here. And he seems to be sincere about this, that he is really trying desperately to figure out what his role in all of this is, and he wants to be a good statesman. He's trying to figure out how is that possible, and what can he do here, especially to overcome some of the difficulties that we've seen. And look at the language that he says, just absolutely beautiful language. If you look there at line 7 on 245, a rising nation spread over a wide and fruitful land, traversing all the seas with the rich productions of their industry, engaged in commerce with nations who feel power and forget right, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the mortal eye. It doesn't get more romantic than that. This is, and just as we saw with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Jefferson's America is the America of the future, as well as one rooted in the past. So we can only understand the Republic if we understand how the Republic will spread westward. That is our only real understanding of what it is. And we have to keep this in mind. A couple of things for context here. America is an agrarian power. It's where our strength is. And Jefferson had a very strong vision that America, to be strong, must be a society of small property owners. if every family had, say, 160 acres of land where we could grow our own food, where we could get up with the sun and go to bed with the sun, where we could practice agriculture in one way in the winter and another way in the spring, another way in the summer and another in the fall, this would be ideal. We're working with creation. Nature is both humbling and enabling at the same time. And that context really matters. We call this yeoman farming. So Y-E-O-M-A-N, a yeoman, meaning a small farmer. So not plantations at all. That is not Jefferson's vision of the future. The future is every family having its own small plot of land. So he does not want an industrial America, and he does not want, at least at this point, an urban America. And he can appreciate both the urban and the industrial, but he doesn't think that's what we should be. We don't want to concentrate power in cities. We want us to remain rural and agricultural, and he believes that we have enough land, even then, where we only had land going to the Mississippi River, so only to St. Louis. He believes that's still enough land for the future of the Republic for 1,000 years or more. We should be okay. You guys remember when we talked about that with the maps that we had, that ideal that we would take that long to get to St. Louis. Yeah, in no way did he understand that when he said this, we were 47 years away from conquering the entire continent from east to west, which is this just never happened in the history of the world, anything like that. So even Jefferson, the smartest guy, is going to get that wrong. But that agriculture really matters for him. And it does beg the question, are we still in any way a Jeffersonian republic, especially considering that very few of us are raised on farms anymore, and that we are an urban people for the most part, and we have been becoming increasingly urban for exactly the last 100 years. So 1920 was the last year in which we had an equal population of those living on farms and those living in cities. We've been moving towards the cities ever since. So that was the last time we had 50-50 divide, not just in population in terms of living, but what people were. That's when 50% of Americans were still farmers too. And now it's down to about 0.25% total. So we're going from Jefferson, where probably 99% of the people are farmers, to today, we're less than 0.25% of the people are farmers. So a lot has changed. And that begs this question, can Jefferson really give us something here that matters? Certainly for the 19th century. For the 20th, it starts getting a little bit more complicated. And we have to think about, what does this great man mean to us? So still, as a part of this first point of context, I also want you to understand, and maybe I'll bring something in on this later when we talk more about economics, but we're also at the very beginning here of the most significant economic growth the world has ever seen, and that we're still in. So we have our recessions and we have our depressions, but and I'm sure many of you have heard this, and if you've taken economics, you know the idea of the hockey stick, where you set the hockey stick down on the ice and you look at its handle, which of course is just steady all the way to the end, and then suddenly it shoots up because that's where you've got the power for hitting with the paddle. And that idea is what happens with economics in the world too. You've got a standard kind of mediocre economic growth for about 4,000 years in human history. And then you get to about 1780, 1790, 1800, and bam, everything takes off. And even in my life, you guys have a longer lifespan than I do, but for my generation, I should be able to live to 80 if everything goes well. For your generation, it's going to be closer to 90. And that is just amazing that we have that, and that our infant mortality is decreased, and that we have so much population, over 7 billion people in the world, incomprehensible 200 years ago. But that was the beginning of this great kind of economic revolution. So that's a context for Jefferson as well. He doesn't understand that, but he sees this prosperity and he recognizes that this is coming. So we'll talk a lot more about that later on in the semester, but for now, just keep that in mind. This is the beginning of the hockey stick, and an understanding of the change in the way that we think about this. Okay, so the second thing I want to give you in context is much shorter, and that is, when we look at something, and I want to explain this well, when we look at something like Jefferson's first inaugural, we have here an almost utopian vision it's Arcadia. It's the ultimate agrarian republic. Everybody's happy. We're not having civil wars. We're not having wars. We're not having violence. We're getting along with one another. We're going to have a minimal government. And everybody just kind of does their own thing. Right? It's this Arcadia. And it is the ultimate expression of kind of American republicanism, small r republicanism. So this is 1801. Now, if you just jump forward to, say, 1897, you've got Vladimir Lenin already completely planning the Russian Revolution. It's the complete opposite. Jefferson is giving us probably the freest society the world has ever seen. Less than 100 years later, Lenin will have planned out the most tyrannical and despotic world system the world has ever seen. So the 19th century is a short century. And I think the difference is what Jefferson is saying here in 1801 is fully an expression of the American Revolution. What Lenin is saying as early as 1897 is fully an expression of the French Revolution. So those tensions are going to be there throughout the 19th century as well. Does that make sense for everyone? So just keep that into context. Yeah, the 18th century seems a lot longer than the 19th century does. It is one short century in terms of what changes and what it means. Okay, Viga, do you mind reading a little more?
During the contest of opinion through which we have passed, the animation of discussion and of exertions has sometimes worn an aspect which might impose on strangers unused to think freely, and to speak and to write what they think. But this being now decided by the voice of the Union, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will of course arrange themselves under the will of the law, and unite in common efforts for the common good. All too will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. And let us reflect that having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little, if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the agonizing spasm of infuriated man, seeking through blood and slaughter his long-lost liberty, it was not wonderful that it was not wonderful that the agitation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less by others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. I know indeed that some honest men fear that a Republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot, in the full tide of a successful experiment, abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm, on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may, by possibility, want energy to preserve itself? I trust not. I believe this, on the contrary, the strongest government on earth. I believe it the only one, where every man at the call of the law would fly to the standard of the law, and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Sometimes it is said that a man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. Let us then, with courage and confidence, pursue our own federal and republican principles, our attachment to union and representative government, kindly separated by nature in a wide ocean front the exterminating havoc of one quarter of the globe, too high-minded to endure the degradations of others, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the thousandth generation, entertaining a due sense of our equal right to the use of our own faculties, to the acquisitions of our own industry, to honor and confidence from our fellow citizens, resulting not from birth, but from our actions and their sense of them, enlightened by a benign religion, professed in deed and practiced in various forms, yet all of them inculcating honesty, truth, temperance, gratitude, and the love of man, acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence, which by all its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here, and his greater happiness hereafter. With all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and prosperous people? Still one thing more, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicity.
Let's stop there, Viga. Thank you. Great job. It just hearing Jefferson just makes my heart sore sometimes. This is such good stuff. And beautifully read. So let's point out a couple of things on this. Notice that Jefferson, again, is giving us this ideal. And it is a high ideal. There's no question about that. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be one among us, one of the ultimate arguments made in world history for free speech right here, if there be one among us who would endanger the Republic by his own words, let him speak, Jefferson says. Critically important. When we have the non-rational, passionate person, we should allow them to speak, even if what they say is offensive or deeply in error. And there are two reasons why this is the case. Number one, you don't want the crazies getting paranoid. If they're truly crazy, you don't want them putting all of their energies into internal anguish, because at some point it will explode, and it will explode with violence. So it's better to let the people who act on their passions be passionate and get it out, not have it all frustrated within. But there's a second side to this as well. When they speak openly, you then have the right and the duty to challenge them equally openly and to show the errors of their opinion to everybody else. We have not seen a statement this profound about free speech since Milton wrote his defense of free speech at the same time he was writing Paradise Lost. This is one of the great defenses in world history, and an understanding of that. Let the crazies speak their mind. Don't make them suffer internally and allow that to explode. So allow them the piece of their opinion to be spread openly. Why? And here's where I think maybe Jefferson, as much as I love his principles, I think he's naive. His belief is that reason will always combat passion. And I think any of us who've spent 5 minutes on Twitter know that that is absolutely not the case. And it's worrisome. It's very worrisome. Right? And we're seeing that, in fact, quite often when people express themselves, they get more and more worked up, not less worked up. But that's something we all have to deal with, and it's something that we have to think about individually more than as a community, but maybe as a community as well. But we want to avoid that. So notice above that was not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle, right around line 30 there on page 246. But above that, with what Viga read, we have this idea of, well, we've seen the history of man as, and I think that's line 25, as a spasm of infuriated man. And here's that naivety of the founders, where they believe that we've ushered in this new ideal in the world in which we will see the reasonable man will now govern himself and govern those around him. That's what Jefferson wants. He wants a society of reason. What will the American West do? The American West is that platform by which we will govern ourselves through reason. It is a gift to us by this overruling providence that we all adore, as Jefferson says. Now, he's next to an atheist, so clearly he doesn't mean for us to take this literally, and yet we can. Right? He's speaking to a lot of people here, and it can be taken in a lot of different ways. So why would we ever allow a society not based on reason to be one in which there's tyranny? He says we would never want the tyrannical. Notice what he says at the top of page 247, at the bottom of that non-full paragraph. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? If you're not reasonable, meaning you can't govern yourself, you absolutely have no right to govern anyone else, right, at all. So basically, this is a tautology. We have to accept that we can govern ourselves, and when we accept we can govern ourselves, we govern ourselves. Right? That's part of what Jefferson is getting at here. And he doesn't want us to be unreasonable. Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer the question. Well, we've already seen that. Right? So this is, as he says, infuriated man, but we are reasonable men. And so what do we want at the end of what Vika just very nicely read? Look at line 20 on 247. We still need one more thing, citizens. A wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement. So basically the government exists for one thing, to secure our property rights. That's it. Everything else is up to us. This is perfectly the sequel of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Right? We form our own communities. This is how we prosper. The government shall do nothing else. And it shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. Now, some of you may be familiar with that. In a Western context, that's a paraphrase of Scripture. But in an American context, this will be the evidence that Abraham Lincoln will use for why slavery is an evil. It says this directly, that I have no right to take from the brow that is sweated. I have no right to take his labor. Right? And that is as true for a white man as a black man, Lincoln says. So I want you to, here's Jefferson perfectly tied to the past, but also anticipating the future in some way. There is, I think, a prophetic sense in what Jefferson is doing. And this is the sum of good government. And this is how we close our felicities, how we get happiness in our society. So Jefferson, I think, is as beautiful and inspiring as he is naive. But it is, he didn't know. Right? And he really does think we're starting something new by entertaining something ancient and allowing this to play out. Okay, next page, we don't need to read, but if you notice, starting at the page at the top of page 248, not surprisingly at all, this whole paragraph there is straight out of common law. These are all our common law rights. So he's given us natural rights, now we have common law rights, and he's following the structure of the Declaration. Get a home run, you might as well try it again on the next one. Right? And I actually do think these are, in some ways, this is even prettier than what Jefferson wrote in the Declaration. He's an older man. He's got more power now. He's seen a lot more. I think there's a lot that he can experience here. Okay, any comments or questions? If not, I'm going to turn the lights off, and I want to look at some slides. So, coming to our second part of the class, and it won't take that long, 10 minutes at most. Okay. So we are, as I've said, now thinking about this kind of grand transition from the republic to a democracy. And in that transition, it's never smooth, and it still is not smooth. We're still in it. But we're trying to figure out what exactly does the republic mean. So as I talked about last week, when we think about the nature of the republic, we have to, thank you guys. We have to understand that there is also a kind of romantic element that falls into this. And so think about Jefferson, the destiny beyond mortal eye. It's so romantic. We're going to see this as well with a republic, and yet what's ironic about this is that republics traditionally have been classical. They're ordered because they come out of the ancient world and they come out of the classical period, and yet our republic in the American sense with people like Jefferson and later Henry David Thoreau and James Fenimore Cooper, we tend to think of our republic in much more romantic terms, and that's a tension. So we already see these tensions between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but we see tensions as well between a classical republic and a romantic republic, and how that's going to play out. So if you remember back to your Western Heritage class, in Western Heritage, we talked a lot about the beginnings of Greek philosophy. And all Greek philosophy, and this is critically important to understand America, but all Greek philosophy, which comes from about 5 centuries before Christ, about 510, 509 BC, in a little town called Miletus, all of the debates that begin are about the nature of cycles. Everything is based on cycles. The early philosophers want to know, why does man come into the earth? Why does he decay? And why does he die? And then why, if the individual is dead, does the species continue? Why does a tree leaf in the spring and then enjoy full green during the summer, and then, of course, lose its leaves in the fall so that it's naked in the winter, only to leave again in the spring. Now, these cycles are very important to the Greeks, and yet they're frustrated by them too. How do we get out of these things? Are we trapped in these cycles? So can we escape them? Is there any possibility, or must we always live them? So republics, as republican theory is developing for people like Plato and Aristotle, and later than Cicero and Livy and Polybius and a number of great thinkers, when they develop the idea of republics, those republics are still trapped in these natural cycles and always will be. So it is inevitable. It can never be otherwise. It is absolutely inevitable that every republic will die. There is no such thing as an eternal republic in this world. That's the city of God for the next world, but not here and not now. So even men like Washington and John Adams, when they founded the American Republic, they knew very well that what they were creating was only a temporary form of government, the best form of government, and the most natural and the most divine, but the one that is also the most fragile, because just like the human body must age and eventually die, the same thing is true with a republic. All republics have to do that because they are natural as well. So Polybius, who was a Greek but captured by the Romans as a slave and liberally educated, and then wrote his History of Rome, says there's no clearer proof of the truth of what I say that could be obtained than by careful observation of the natural origin, genesis, and decadence of these several forms of government. But it's only by seeing distinctly how each of them is produced that a distinct view can be obtained of its growth, zenith, and decadence. And so its beginning, its middle, and its end, and the time, circumstance, and place in which each of these may be expected to recur. So we're going to have these cycles over and over again. And when we look at Livy, who is writing during the time of Caesar Augustus, lamenting the loss of the Republic, writes, "To the following considerations I wish everyone seriously and earnestly to attend, by what kind of men and by what sort of conduct in peace and war the empire has been both acquired and extended." What happened to the Republic? Why are we in this empire? And what do we find? That as discipline gradually declined, let him follow in his thoughts the structure of ancient morals, at first, as it were, leaning aside, then sinking farther and farther, then beginning to fall precipitate, until he arrives at the present times when our vices have attained such a height of enormity that we can no longer endure either the burden of them or the sharpness of the necessary remedies. All decline. Like the whole history of Livy looking at Rome is the history of moral decline. Now, here's a very sobering thought, but I want you all to know this, and I guarantee you this will in some form, way, shape, or form end up on either your next midterm or on your final. Every one of the founders, without exception, every one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence believed that at the end of his own age, the Republic was already dead. There was not one, not Washington, not Adams, not Jefferson, none of them believed that the Republic survived to their own day. They thought it was already gone. And that's why you get someone like Jefferson. He doesn't mean this literally, it's more symbolic, but he says every generation must water the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants. He's not calling for a revolution every 20 years. He's reminding us how easily we decline. So one of my favorite founders is someone, my guess, is most of you have not heard of, and that's unfortunate. It's not your fault. She's just rarely taught, but she's amazing. A woman by the name of Mercy Otis Warren. Wonderful, wonderful writer and thinker. She was one of the leading anti-federalists and wrote a number of the anti-federalist articles, but of course didn't get credit because she was a woman, and she wrote under a pseudonym. But she also wrote in 1805 the second history of the American Revolution written up to that point. So a guy, David Ramsey, you don't need to know his name, but David Ramsey had written one in 1789, and then Mercy Otis Warren writes her 3-volume history of the American Revolution in 1805. And if any of you go into politics or history, please read this book. You can download it for free from the online Library of Liberty. It is, I think, the best book ever written on the American Revolution. But the point she wants to make from 1776 to 1805 is that just like the Roman Republic fell into the empire, so we have fallen as well. And notice what she puts here. She, meaning America, has in her great measure lost her simplicity of manners and those ideas of mediocrity which are generally the parent of content. The Americans are already in too many instances hankering after the sudden accumulation of wealth and the proud distinctions of fortune and title. They have too far lost that general sense of moral obligation to the res publica, to the republic. They've lost that. Right? And then jump to that last paragraph there. If this should ever become the deplorable situation of the United States, let some unborn historian in a far distant day detail the lapse and hold up the contrast between the simple, virtuous, and free people of 1776 with the degenerate, servile race of beings corrupted by wealth, effeminated by luxury, impoverished by licentiousness, who have become automatons, right, the robots of intoxicated ambition. They're not thinking about the res publica. They're not thinking about the common good. They're thinking about self-interest. And that's what Warren is worried about here. So I'm going to do this very quickly, and you can look this up. This is Thomas Cole, called The Course of Empire. You can find this anywhere online. Very famous kind of examination of the stages of empire. And like I said, we're going to go through this relatively quickly. I want you to notice here that we've got the cycle. I hope you all see that. It's in the picture itself. Right? And you'll see that to a greater or lesser degree in the following pictures as well. You have here primitive man hunting, gathering. Here's a hunter and gatherer right here, walking along the path, but he is moving towards settlement. And there you have a series of teepees up on a plateau. And notice nature is moving away, where man is moving from the sunlight towards the darkness, but the darkness is moving away, and he's gaining in civilization. And keep this peak in mind. So if you can imagine from where I am next to that peak will just put me about right here where Kathleen is. So this is where we're at in terms of perspective. And then we go to the next stage. And the next stage is the beginning of Arcadia, where everything is good. Notice where those teepees were. So we're now about where David is. Notice where the teepees were. They are now replaced by a pagan altar, by some kind of center of worship in terms of paganism. And now there's that peak again, not quite as high as it looked in the earlier one. In fact, we see that there's another one behind it, which we didn't see earlier. But the darkness is allowing us, by its movement away, we're discovering things. We still have the people here. There's the old man who was the hunter-gatherer. Now he's a wise old man with his stick sitting there, and you already have the development of domestic felicity, mom, dad, 3 children around them, very happy. And back here, we've got a kind of bucolic situation, people in the woods. The woods are no longer threatening, they're nice. And here we've got David with his sheep. Everything is becoming very, very nice. And then we get to the full-blown republic. And yet, what do we see with the republic? Now we've changed completely, so I'm not even where Mason is. I'm probably about right here now from that peak. The peak is much smaller than it used to be. Notice now the temple to God is higher than the peak that once threatened us. And you can see here that the water has become completely calm and domesticated, and it's all for a river of transportation and commerce. It's our gateway to the world now, and even the very painting, our civilization is looking outward. But notice there's too much luxury. They're already entering their decadent phase. Drapes everywhere. Everything looks kind of lazy. People are just sitting around eating and talking, and they're not really being conducive to a republic as we might think it. And then, of course, inevitably, it all falls apart. And this is painting number 4. And notice the peak got a little larger again, and we got a little bit smaller, and we've got people. There's the bridge of Khazad-dûm right there, right? There's Gandalf and the Balrog. Everything's falling apart right there. This poor woman is being pushed into the water by a man. Here we've got a primitive guy with fire. We don't know what he's going to do with it. Monuments of war, The temple is missing. Everything is falling apart. And then we get to the final stage, and there's nothing left of any human beings. We see no evidence of living human beings. We only see the graveyard. We see the monuments. This is what they understood a republic to be. So I want everybody to understand this. This is inevitable. The trick is, how do you make that part where it's the glorious part, how do you make that last as long as possible without falling into this? But it will fall. Just as it's inevitable that each one of us will die, so too the republic must die at some point. So look those up from Thomas Cole and give those a nice look when you get a chance. Okay, any questions? All right.